A lot of the ideas around divinity and Son of God have not yet developed within that community. But then something changes. A second group of adherents come into the body of what would be the community of the beloved disciple. And as we know from Bishop Tim's, I was about to call you Father Tim, Bishop Tim's lecture yesterday, talking about that the temple was a large issue, and of course a large part of the lives of everyone at that time. This, of course, having an anti-temple bias is significant, that people who were not a fan of ritual or temple worship came into the group of the people who would follow with the beloved disciple, Jesus. Likely, scholars suspect that it was actually Samaritans. One of the reasons why they suspect this, of course, is John 4, where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well and converts her. And then from there, her experience with Jesus at the well, she runs back to her village and goes, hey guys, I met this awesome guy. Given the comments in John 4 about worshiping in spirit, and things like that, it reflects an anti-temple bias. That now things are going to begin, at least for this community, to move from the realm of ritual worship, of sacrifice, of a central location, to something that is very, very individual, very personal. Stage 2 takes place around 90 AD, and that's the date I have for everything, so no wonky dates. This is the Gospel era. This is when the Gospel of John itself was written. And no matter how spiritual, no matter how well-intended, it's kind of like when you post things on the internet, when I post things about the AJC, congratulations, we just had this big event. There will always be some people that will, see it as a bit of propaganda. And the Gospel of John was a bit of propaganda, not only, for their own benefit, but for the benefit of everybody else, if such a thing can be said, because it defines their relation to outsiders. The Gospel of John says, as a group, this is who we are. If you're not doing this, if you're not a part of this, well, then you're kind of, you're out here. And there are 6 or 7 different groups that you can pick out between the lines of the Gospel of John as being identified by this community and kind of picked on, so to speak. Folks like themselves, folks who don't accept Jesus. I don't have a list, I apologize. But essentially, it identifies a series of groups and basically gives the community's opinion on it, how they relate. Followers of John the Baptist, for example. Now, the second group, I mentioned the second group and the anti-temple bias, where things begin to move out of a central location, out of a ritual idea, and for lack of a less fluffy phrase, into the heart a bit. As a result of that, because God, because Jesus as a prophet, as a Messiah of God, because these things begin to become more personal, they also become more spiritual. And as they become more spiritual, we encounter something called high Christology. Now, Christology in Christian theology, of course, is the study of the nature of Christ. And every major dispute, every major disagreement, every argument in Christianity is about Christ. Unlike us, where we argue about clothes. So, and because the nature of Christ, what we say about Christ is what we say about ourselves. Was Christ God? Was Christ man? And so Christ's relation to God is kind of our relation to God. So it has a huge impact on how people see themselves in terms of salvation, in terms of spiritual and personal development. So as a result of this anti-temple bias, things get turned up a notch. And now we're not simply dealing with a Messiah or a leader or somebody who's going to overthrow Rome. We're dealing with God himself, with the Son of God, with walking the earth and breaking bread and cursing fig trees. Unfortunately, the parent tradition of this community was not so happy with that development. And they said, you know what? If you're going to believe that, if you're going to adhere to that, if you're going to preach that, you need to get out. You are no longer welcome to worship with us. Now there is a distinction, between Jew and Christian. And one of the things that's interesting, I should note, and you heard about it in some of the write-ups for, has everybody here seen The Passion of the Christ? Good for you for not watching. The Passion of the Christ takes the Gospel of John very, very literally. And the problem with the Gospel of John, when you take it very, very literally, when you just take it as simple statements, is that it comes across as very anti-Semitic. And so it's very funny when we say, well, we're the Johannite Church, we're big on John, we're big on the Gospel of John. Well, isn't the Gospel of John anti-Semitic? How do you explain that? Why does it always seem to be that Jesus is always like, those Jews are bad? Well, here's the thing. As I mentioned, that between the lines in the Gospel, you have the life of the community reflected. The folks who put together the Gospel weren't exactly happy with their parent tradition, because as a result of their expanding and evolving beliefs, they were told they couldn't worship. They were told they couldn't participate. So as a part of that, they turned around and said, "These guys are bad. They kicked us out." So that's where you get the idea. I mean, the idea, however, that there are bits in there that are anti-Semitic is kind of funny, because it's Jews complaining about other Jews, right? It's not some kind of outside group saying, this whole race of people is bad. It's their own people, and they no longer feel welcome. So that's where the source of the anger and the animosity comes from. So they get booted out of the synagogue, and this is reflected in a few places in Scripture, describing that, well, you can't worship anymore because you follow Jesus. Now, the interesting thing, of course, how we know that some of this is written backwards, how we know that the community of John got kicked out of the synagogue and as a part of it, reflected in the writings, is that at the time of Jesus, at the time of the community of the beloved disciple, in its origins, they hadn't been kicked out of the synagogue. That's something that happened much later. So when they turn around to write their history, they write it backwards in time, to say that this conflict we have had with these other people, who are actually us, this conflict that we had, it's been going on the whole time, and that's why we're right to be mad. So they wrote it into their history. They made it a part of their thing, which is actually quite unfortunate. Now, when people get kicked out of things, when it's closing time and you can't do anything else, unless you're ready to nap, you're probably pretty unhappy. But before we get to the unhappy, let's look why a little bit more why they got kicked out. Successful evangelism. They're bringing in other people. It's like now they're not just bringing in other Jews. They're bringing in Samaritans, and of course, Jews didn't like Samaritans in that day. It's not. There's a funny skit you should watch from Mitchell and Webb. I'll leave it at that. But they weren't big on Samaritans, at least in the context of that time period in the gospel. So you don't exactly necessarily want one group of your brothers and sisters bringing in other groups that you don't really like. It's like, hey, they didn't pay their dues. They didn't go through their hazing, or they don't have their membership card. Did you want to check with us before you admit these people? Purge reaction to the destruction of the temple. Often when things go terribly wrong, you look for somebody to blame. No different than Augustine writing a defense of Christianity, on barbarian invasions. Well, Rome wouldn't have been sacked if it wasn't for those nasty Christians. I do hope I have that right. You're the Augustine guy. Yeah. So the temple gets destroyed. And of course, this is the center of worship. This is the center of religious life. And we're not too happy. We need to pin it on somebody. How about those guys get out? And of course, as I mentioned, the disagreement with the high Christology. What are these other folks smoking? I mean, now they're saying this guy, in sandals is not simply some kind of revolutionary leader. He's actually God, which is a pretty big deal. I mean, we can turn around and we can say, okay, well, this is something that we're very accustomed to, that we're very used to. We're used to hearing about Jesus as God. We have for the last 2,000 years. But what if I turned around and said Bray was God? You would say, okay, I can see Bray. He's sitting right there. There's no halo. There's no miracles. It looks pretty normal to me. And what if I said, okay, well, now you've got to follow Bray? There would probably be a little bit of reaction. Sorry, Bray, I realize you're a really nice guy, but yeah. So the community responds, and now they get critical of the folks that came with them, who kind of are still a little bit wishy-washy, on the fence. They're like, rah, rah, Jesus is our man. Just don't ask me to say that in public. So now, because they've had this split with their parent tradition, they're looking for, who else may not like them, for who else may have a problem. So now the lukewarm followers of Jesus are being picked on. Now, enter the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple, historically, scholarly, academically, is unknown. Traditionally, we identify that with John the Apostle. It's convenient, it's nice, tells a great story, but in truth, not necessarily the case. The beloved disciple is a part of the group that goes to a higher Christology and helps everybody else to make this transition. Hey, this Jesus guy really is God. Hey, Bray, this guy Bray, he's really, really good. Sorry. So how high of a Christology are we talking about? Just exactly how God was Jesus in the gospel. Jesus cannot ask a simple question without a footnote explaining that he already knew the answer. He's pretty smart. Jesus cannot choose a follower who goes bad without an insistence that, yeah, I knew this was going to happen from the beginning. It's okay. Jesus cannot utter a prayer of petition without the assurance that he's really just doing it for bystanders' sake and educate him to the truth that the Father actually already hears him. He's just kind of picking up the phone and going, hello, so that everybody sees, that he's on the phone. Jesus cannot ask that at the hour of his passion that it pass from him, as he does in other Gospels, because he's doing this on purpose. He knows what he's doing. The crucifixion, the sacrifice, the trial, the arrest, it's all part of his plan. He's in control, absolutely. The passion is not narrated in a way that places him at the mercy of his captors, because he has the power to lay down his life and take it up again. So obviously, this isn't somebody who's being pushed around. This is somebody who's moving the pieces on the board. This is how they feel about Jesus, that all these things are put into the text to remind you, in case you didn't know, that Jesus is divine. Now, before the third stage, of course, we have, in between each of these stages, there are events that kind of change and redirect the course of the community. Now, of course, the Johannine community, as in the previous stage, has been rejected by their parent tradition. So in response, they say, well, we need more people. I guess we kind of can't go back to where we used to worship and get those guys to come out. Now we're going to take in people that are completely different. And in come the Gentiles, everybody else. One of the things that points to the fact that there were non-Jews coming into the community is because the gospel stops to explain terms that would already be known to Jews, like rabbi, for example. A Jewish reader would already know what rabbi means. And part of the Gentile group, of course, when you have around there is Romans and Greeks, and because those pretty much are the Gentiles at that point for a majority of in terms of majority of the population. And it's interesting because in the gospel, when the Greeks start showing up, Jesus says, "I'm done. I'm done. Ministry is at an end. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And of course, this is the sun stop is highlighted in John 12. Stage 3 is where things get soap opera-ish, because it wasn't before. Greek contact brings out universalistic aspects of Johannine belief. Now we're not dealing with a particular people or a particular group of people that will be saved. The whole world can be saved through him. And this is augmented with a bit of dualism that says, by the whole world they mean everybody who agrees with us. And everybody who's not in that thing, well, maybe not. It is then that now they have distinguished themselves so much with their theology, with their opposition to their parent tradition, that now they're standing on their own. However, it's kind of like, I'm sure you maybe not on this side of the water, but I know in North America there's a saying that the rest of your life resembles high school. That no matter, I was looking like what, things tend to be a little bit dramatic and a little bit emotional and a little bit intense, no matter how old you get. And it's certainly true for this community because, right after they establish their own identity, right after they draw a line, in the sand that says, "This is us, good people here, bad people there, sheep go to heaven, goats go to hell," they start arguing among each other. Well, what happens when you lack a common enemy? You turn on yourself. So now they're arguing over Christology. And of course, things like the Eucharist. I know one thing I mentioned during Tim's excellent talk yesterday is that some of these things are reflected in the gospel. Of course, this is how we know about the life of the community, by reading the gospel, because their struggles come off the pages. You have a group of disciples that follow with Jesus, and Jesus says, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at the Greek for that, he's literally talking about eating flesh and drinking blood. that's literally to kind of gnaw on, actually. And, some of these disciples say, "This is a hard teaching. Who can bear it? And we're leaving, we're out of here." So they go. And this is reflected, so this is where that reflects the split. That says, okay, now this group is splitting into factions. It's also believed that some of the Greeks that came in as a result of the Samaritans are converting more Samaritans. It's a big conversion party. The Gospel of John, as I mentioned earlier, defines the community versus the outsiders, versus the world. Now, at this point in time, at 100 AD, you now have the epistles, the letters that community leaders are writing to members of their own community to warn them about other members of their own community. So the Gospel of John defines the essential community versus the outsiders, versus the world, but the epistles are directed at insiders. And it should be noted, as I mentioned yesterday in Tim's lecture, that the gospel is first used by heterodox Christians who would become Gnostic. It is first used by the quote-unquote bad guys. We had it first. I'm sorry. Later, of course, the proto-Orthodox, what Raymond Brown calls the great church, the Apostolic Church, the mainstream church, adopts it. But the only reason they adopt it is because it's kind of been modified, toned down, and explained by the letters that are written to complain about other members of the community. To say that, the Gospel of John presents this particular theology, here's how we see this theology, as opposed to those other guys who are also using this book who interpret it badly.
There was even some debate at the councils defining the canon, whether or not to include both the apocalypse and the